Should President Trump be elected to a second term? I would like to consider some of the reasons I think that he should and some of the reasons why I think that he shouldn't be elected to a second term, and then give my summary. I would like to get your feedback on any of the points, all the points that I'm making, and my conclusion, points that I've left out and should take into consideration, how you view things differently, and why you would reach a different conclusion. So let me go ahead and run through the list that I've outlined. Why Trump, things that he did or might be expected to do that would justify giving him a second term. One of the first things I would note is that he challenged the status quo. Riding down the elevator when he initially announced his plan to run for president on the Republican ticket, he immediately was indicating that this was going to be a different kind of election, a different kind of election than most people expected, just because he was a different kind of person than the average politician. Uh, Honestly, I was never a Trump fan. Trump's uh, TV show I never watched. I didn't know really much about Trump other than he was the big real estate developer in New York City, who would make the news from time to time in different contexts, different circles. So I didn't know him anything about Trump outside of his general occasional appearance in the national headlines. Did not feel at first that he had many positions that I agreed with, particularly as I understood and thought about what I knew about him and picked up on him from the things I'd heard over the years. But then I realized that he had at least come to believe, if he hadn't always believed, certain ideas that were more in line with Republican policies and then my policies in general. And even so, he was going to challenge the status quo that politicians across the aisle, on both sides of the aisle, would bring to the table. He brought a new perspective on international affairs. Many of his ideas and approaches, his actions, I disagreed with at the time, or at least wondered how they could bring about any positive results. Now, a couple of years after his exit from the national stage or international stage as president of the United States, I think a lot of his ideas merit more consideration than they were given at the time. And had they been followed, the ideas and the approaches that he took in certain contexts with respect to certain issues, had they been followed over the decades before, would have led to a better um, world world stage situation than what we have now. A new perspective on NATO. This is one of the things that I was very concerned about. His criticisms of NATO, the challenge he um, leveled against NATO, and yet as I've looked over the last year or so, year and a half, at NATO and considered the purpose of NATO, the post-Soviet Union, etc., and the things that have led up to the Russia-Ukraine war, I think he was really onto something. Not just that the other nations in NATO should pay more to support NATO as an institution, as an organization, but just the very need for NATO, the justification of NATO as an entity in the post-Soviet Union world. I do think, and we'll talk about this later, that the world would be in a better position today had the U.S. adopted more constructive policies towards Russia and the former Soviet Union states in the post Cold War era than they adopted. But we'll get into that more later. But he raised that question, made it an issue that everybody had to think about differently than they had in previous decades. And then a new perspective for conservatives on Social Security and Medicare, essentially taking it off the table, saying we're not going to deal with that, as opposed to the traditional conservative Republican approach to saying that we need to cut these entitlement programs without providing a plan that would substantively address the issues that would be raised were Social Security and Medicare actually cut. Uh, Realistic proposals for dealing with the expense incurred in these programs in a way that recognize that people depend on them, that it's part of the fabric now, whether we think it should be or not, whether the whole New Deal plan should have been enacted or should not have been enacted is kind of a moot point at this juncture because it was enacted. So, how can we deal with the actual cost of Social Security and Medicare on the federal budget in a way that both protects the individuals and their dependency on these programs that is now built into the system while putting them on a financial footing that we as a nation can sustain in the long term. And tied to this is, with respect to NATO and international affairs and other things, um, trying to force even conservatives to deal realistically with the fact that we can't fund everything and we can't have all the funding we want for everything across the board. What can we realistically cut? What can we realistically cut back on? What can we restructure in a way that both accomplishes our objectives as a nation and makes it economically feasible to do so? The willingness to think outside the box. So the big picture issue is that he's going to force politicians on both sides of the aisle to think about their traditional perspectives. Uh, Trump, I feel like, came to the Republican side of the aisle in his quest for the presidency, in part because he felt like he could bring together uh, a coalition of people that would earn him not only the nomination, but the uh, presidency by speaking to issues that he at least adopted to secure that nomination, to secure the support of different groups, even if he, in his long history prior to running for president, had not explicitly supported those ideas, had even supported ideas in opposition to the traditional and what ultimately became his Republican platform. Um, but he forced everybody to rethink what they're doing and why they're doing it when it comes to political action, political ideology. And for me, general agreement with the direction of policies related to the courts and general social issues insofar as they are addressed at the federal level. There was much that I agreed with that he accomplished, even stuff that was accomplished outside of the headlines that the people focused on. So there's much that he accomplished in the general framework and the way he was moving many things I agreed with, but there are some things in that context that we'll talk about in a minute that I disagree with. And then also a reversal of many negative policy trends under President Biden and continuation of positive policy trends from his first term. So picking up on that last thought, if he were given a second term, then many of the things that have happened under President Biden that I disagree with would presumably come to a stop and perhaps be reversed. And some of the things that Trump did, policy wise and just general direction of the country wise, that I thought were positive, would hopefully be picked back up and move forward again. And one major issue is reconsideration of foreign policy, particularly with respect to the Ukraine Russia war. I don't think that it is unlikely that we would not be in war um, if President Trump had been elected to a second term and were in office for the last 2 years as opposed to President Biden. And we'll never be able to go back to what we could have done to prevent the war because the war has started. But we can hopefully somehow get to a point where the war comes to an end and we can move forward and do things in a more enlightened manner with more positive results, not just for Russia and Ukraine, but for the world at large. And so President Trump, I think, would force, if we even get that far, would force a reconsideration of that policy. I mean, 2 years is a long way away, the Ukraine-Russia war may have been resolved. The world might have experienced to be in the midst of World War III. Who knows what's going to happen over the next 2 years in this very volatile situation. But on the assumption that the war is still going on, I think Trump would fairly quickly force us to reconsider what we're doing in that regard. But now let's consider why not Trump, things that he did or might be expected to do that would justify not getting him a second term. So first, Trump is about Trump. I think everybody who runs for political office is running because they think that they can do well for the people and themselves in the context of running for office. That isn't necessarily a bad thing. But as I read an article, as I recall, that discussed Trump and who he was, his background, his history. I mean, there's a lot about Trump that I just simply don't relate to. He comes from a different world almost in the context of New York and real estate and what he has to deal with versus the life that I've had. So he's got a whole different approach and view on things than I do just because of the background, life background, life experiences. The other thing, though, that struck me is that much of what he did, even when it was negative public publicity, was to promote the brand of Trump. And so, not that I think that he would have, in an illegal way, sought the presidency to secure benefits for him and his business, his brand, etc. I think he would probably have been much more successful in that regard had he simply stayed away from the presidency and politics altogether. But ultimately, at the end of the day, Trump is about Trump, and I think that shows in the context of other things that we'll talk about here in just a moment. As I alluded to earlier, he seemed to adopt some positions, and even if he adopted them sincerely in the context of trying to decide where he was going to stand on certain issues if he were to run for president as a Republican nominee, but he converted to many positions in search of political power base. And so the degree to which he is sincere, that is great. The degree to which he is simply expressing support for certain positions as a politician in search of votes, well, that's a problem that I think we all have with all politicians. Although it may be, in fact, what we force politicians to do in the context of seeking votes and seeking election to different positions. Excessive involvement of family members in positions in which they had no experience. There's a certain degree of ability to negotiate things that accrues to an individual because of the experiences that they have. But there's also a certain degree of a certain degree of ability to address issues that come from having been involved with those issues over a long period of time. I'm not convinced that all of his family, Jared Kushner and the rest of his children, etc., were as effective as others might have been in the roles in which they served. I'm not convinced, in particular, with respect to Jared Kushner and the Middle East relationships that he developed and things that have transpired since he left office, that there weren't things that ought to perhaps have been looked into with respect to what was done in the context of serving in those positions as unelected representatives of the government based on President Trump appointing them as opposed to others. Now, it's difficult to know how anybody in politics could appoint anybody they don't know to serve in a role because they need to know, they need to trust that the people that are serving will represent the elected leader, the leader's wishes with respect to what are we trying to accomplish in these areas. Mideast peace, relationships with any nation, et cetera, et cetera. So it's difficult. I mean, it's easiest for somebody who has a family member that they trust and think can get things done, to put them in a position of leadership and responsibility. But I'm not always convinced that the best was accomplished in the shortest amount of time. 4 years is relatively short given the history of and the future of, hopefully, the future of the nation. But the degree to which family members may or may not have been the best choices to serve in certain roles is something that could be looked into. And limited effectiveness in draining the swamp. Now, while he was an outsider, um, he didn't necessarily make sweeping changes to how Washington operates in a way that translated to a different Washington after he left it than it was when he came into it. And this, as I mentioned later in this list, that may be something that would have been more clear, he would have been more effective at in a second term than he was in only one term. I think one of the things that has come to light in just recent months is the degree to which the Washington power structure is in fact centered a lot in the structure of Washington D.C. as opposed to the people that we elect, particularly the president, every 2 or 4 years. And so there may be only so much swamp that can be drained given the current structure, and we'll talk about that later. Failure to effectively frame America's response to COVID-19, including, and here I want to address some things where I really think one of the biggest failures of Trump's presidency was his response to COVID-19, both initially and in the ensuing months prior to his leaving office. Yes, I know that the vaccine was developed in record time. Can't remember now what the name of the operation was. Operation Warp Speed. But even that, in hindsight, I recognize, may not have been the best way to approach things. But some of the issues, particularly with respect to COVID-19, delayed recognition of the potential threat, downplaying, or at least presenting to the public, a downplaying of the potential threat and what we might need to do to respond to that, to prepare for that. And yet, in that context, as we found out later, an establishment of the principle, excuse me, of the necessary lie to the American people, rather than providing an honest summary of what was and was not known in the ongoing effort to address COVID-19. I think that one of the overarching themes of COVID-19 was a failure of American leadership and worldwide leadership, but American leadership in particular, from the president to Fauci and others who were looked to for direction, to be honest with what they knew, what they didn't know, what would or wouldn't work, et cetera, et cetera. There's a point at which leaders are leading and doing the best they can and ask people to trust them in their efforts. And that when we elect leaders, particularly when we elect leaders, we expect them to do the best they can, given what they know, given what is generally available. We want them to deal with the details. That's why we elect them, rather than us thinking we need to know all the details ourselves. But when it comes out that over and over again, the information that we were provided was either incomplete or misrepresented or just an outright lie, then you begin to destroy the very trust in the system, the establishment, the people in that system that is necessary for leaders to be effective and for people as a whole to feel like they can trust their leadership. And I just think that that's one of the major things. And then in that context, the destruction of trust in not only in government institutions, but science in general, a misunderstanding of what science can and cannot do and how science functions. And that's just a whole nother topic that others have addressed and we'll look at later. And then an undue extension of governmental powers through agencies such as the NIH, CDC, the HHS, and teachers' unions regarding how to respond to the situation. Um, and this follows on the previous point that in the context of not fully grasping what should or shouldn't be done, we gave so much authority to people who didn't know what was going on to make decisions that now, again, in hindsight, were not the best decisions and at times simply the wrong decisions. And not only wrong, but wrong based on what was known and how science and decision making should take place. That now we've got government used to, federal and state and local governments used to having powers that we may wish we hadn't given them, that we may be wanting to claw back from them over time, particularly in another pandemic. The development of additional government programs such as the CARES Act, which added upwards of $3 trillion to the debt. Again, I'm not saying that the pandemic wasn't an incredible and in many ways unique situation, in part because of the difference in the world today compared to any time prior to the last 20 years with 24/7 news, with all the social media. It's just a different world. I don't think we appreciate often how different the world is today than, say, the world was when the Spanish flu pandemic took place back in the early 20th century. It's not apples to apples, simply looking at the pandemic then versus a pandemic now. What we went through with COVID and what we will go through with the next one. Um, it's just a different world, and we'll talk about it in a different context. Um, but in the context of how the federal government responded, it opened the floodgates to trillions of dollars of debt under Trump, trillions more dollars of debt under Biden, and a situation now in which we talk about $1 trillion budgets with no real thought, $1 trillion additions to the debt with no real thought to what we're doing in the long term impact. And so, and again, recognizing that pandemic and COVID was a totally unique situation in the current context of how the world is structured and how society is structured. Part of our leaders' jobs is to be ready to lead in these kinds of situations, to have effective tools to sit down and work through these types of issues. And I think two things. One, I don't think it appears that many of the tools that were in place or should have been in place had been compromised by Republican and slash Trump uh, policy decisions in the period leading up to COVID hitting. And two, by a sense that we simply need to throw money to the American people at these issues in the context of trying to work through this issue without any real concern for what's the best way to financially support America through this in light of the long term repercussions of whatever we do today. And we can talk about that later as well. Trump way or the highway, rather than building a strong coalition of various ideas within the party. Again, Trump had, it would appear, an uncanny sense of what at least his base and the Republican base in general, and many in America, were interested in or wanted to see done in the context of moving ideas forward, of changing the way we approach certain things. But there seemed to be a relative inability to compromise, to work through and resolve both the traditional political way of doing things, Trump's outsider approach to doing things, in a way that actually moved people forward, move the party forward, move people policies forward in a way that would benefit Americans long term. And perhaps the biggest issue is a failure to set aside personal grievances for the greater good. and this gets back to, Trump is about Trump. 2020 election and the Georgia Senate races. The last 2 years would have been very different had even one of the Senate seats in Georgia gone to a Republican as opposed to both going to a Democrat. And it seems to me that that result in Georgia, both seats being held by Democrats after the 2020 election, the special election in January, was a direct result of President Trump's response to losing the 2020 election. I don't know that we will ever know, or at least in my lifetime, ever know exactly some of the things that happened in the 2020 election that may or may not have been on the up and up. But either way, the election was called. President Biden was made president, declared to be president. And rather than simply moving forward with that and working then, particularly after the election, to secure the Georgia Senate seats for Republicans, Trump just insisted on challenging those results with no effective basis for the challenges other than he just felt like there's no way it could have been right. Even to this day, he has not provided solid evidence that would cause anybody to reconsider that he lost. And that costs Republicans, and I think it ultimately costs the country in many ways. And then leading up to the debacle of the 2022 midterm races, it is not clear to me how there could be any doubt that Trump's approach to addressing politics with a focus on trying to, quote, right past wrongs is going to move America forward in any way. The number of people that Trump endorsed that lost some key races, again, Senate seats in Pennsylvania, in Arizona, governorships, there are just too many losses in too many critical areas that are tied to people who support Trump's approach to politics and Trump's personal perpetual grievance regarding the 2020 election that I think we can ignore. We can't ignore that. I mean, it's just a failure of leadership to focus on that as opposed to the bigger picture issues that need to be addressed going forward. And I think it's a big problem that really, in fact, I really think that this more than anything is why Trump should not be given a second term and why it would be better for Republicans and the nation in general if he simply did not run, if he would just back out of the election. Further hardening of the lines of the division between parties, which exacerbated a general inability to reach across the aisle on points of agreement. And part of this is outside of Trump's control, but part of it is because of who Trump is, just the animosity that the other side, many Democrats, hold against President Trump, made it difficult and if not impossible to reach across the aisle and do anything that would be for the general good of the country, even when there were certain issues and points that they agreed on. Now, there are many things that Trump did that I think were positive, that involved and included bipartisan support, that he didn't get much credit for because the media, I mean, Trump was working against a stacked deck, being an outsider and being one who elicited either generally strong feelings for or against. The degree to which he had all of the media, and as it seems to become more and more evident, many of the institutional aspects of federal government working against him all along the way. I mean, it's incredible that he got anything done, but he didn't do anything himself to try to mediate those barriers. And that's part of his next point, is reflected in his current attack ads on Governor DeSantis, his focus on the politics of personal destruction rather than political policy and governmental record. Um, Trump does not handle those with whom he disagrees well in a way that is constructive. And this was evidenced from his first debates and his tendency to label people with uh, nicknames that highlighted what he thought were weaknesses or failures on their part. But here we are, Governor DeSantis, I don't believe at this point, as I'm recording this, has even formally announced any plan to run for president. But in the general sense that he is going to, and he would be the primary, the lead, potential lead for a Republican nominee, uh, clear lead if Trump weren't running. Trump has already begun to launch negative attack ads on Governor DeSantis with respect to DeSantis as a person, as opposed to DeSantis policies and his record as governor of Florida. The ad hominem attacks of Trump as part of who he is as a person is destructive both within the Republican Party and outside of the Republican Party in the context of governing in general. And so and I think it's a thing that many have suggested. Many Republicans and the American people in general are just tired of Trump being Trump. There's a point at which certain aspects of that may have been effective, and I would debate that much of it was effective at all in the long run, but may have been effective in the short run to try to get some things changed and stirred up in Washington. But when it comes to actual governance and doing the things a leader needs to do to make things happen in a democratic setting, Trump's approach is not constructive; it's destructive. Uh, One of his primary Achilles heels, I think, is Twitter. Of course, he's been off for a while, but Twitter storm that marked his presidency that distracted from progress on important issues. He was his own worst enemy when it came to creating issues because of his unwillingness to moderate his commentary. Um, Again, perhaps as a business person, perhaps as a real estate mogul in uh, New York City, perhaps that approach to any news is good news works. But when he became president, it was no longer a matter of him doing things that elevated him and kept him in the news. It was a matter of him doing things in a way that led to constructive policies and actions on behalf of the American people. And his perpetual use of Twitter to make comments, to raise issues, to jab people that he disagreed with, uh, both in the Republican Party and outside the Republican Party, did nothing to foster an environment in which progress could be made. Keeping issues alive because of his unwillingness to frame his comments in a way that people ask him to, for fear of letting it appear that someone else was winning. Uh, and again, I think that many issues get misrepresented by people on both the right and the left as they try to frame issues to make their side, their perspective appear the better in a certain situation. But there were many times when all he had to say, for example, when it comes to Charlotte, was I denounce, white supremacy, and it very likely might have put that issue to rest. I think that he did, in fact, denounce that. I think that he did make some comments that could have been, should someone have desired to, interpreted negatively, which the mainstream media did, et cetera, et cetera. But rather than responding in a way that simply put it to rest, he just kept saying, I already addressed that, and kept the issue alive. And burning bridges as soon as he believed that someone did not support him. And I think this is one, again, a major issue, is that he does not agree to disagree. If someone who supported him disagrees with him, or um, if someone who supported him disagrees with him, um, they are persona non grata. They are no longer a person. He drags stuff up to put them down and try to clear them from the stage. Um, he does not handle even friends who disagree with him, let alone enemies who disagree with him, well. And it's very destructive to the whole process. Basically, if he were to running for a second term, let alone if he were elected, he comes to the table as a divisive figure with no skill at or interest in bridging the left-right divide in a way that moves America forward. I'm not saying that anybody on the left is interested in bridging that divide or is putting forth any constructive policies or framework for dealing with the divisions that we have in America. But I think President Trump certainly doesn't. In the same way that Hillary Clinton did not offer that for the Democrats in the 2016 election. It's almost like if the Democrats had put almost anybody forward other than Hillary Clinton in 2016, it's hard to see how Trump would have won. But we seem to be in a situation where many of our elections are not about voting for a person or a platform, but voting against a person or a platform that we don't want to see in charge. And Trump, I would suggest, does nothing to offers. There's no way that I see Trump serving as a figure to bring America together. The degree to which any of the above issues might have been addressed and become positives had he been voted to a second consecutive term likely was lost to President Biden. Maybe he would have been more effective at draining the swamp. Maybe he would have been more effective at getting certain policies negotiated across the aisle had he been elected to a second term and been able to put many of the things that we now know were absolute falsehoods, Russiagate, etc., behind him in a second term. But whatever might have happened had he been elected to an immediate second term and carried on some of the positive energy from his first term, whatever might have happened has been lost because President Biden won the election in 2020. And then finally, a second term now will be a lame duck presidency with any momentum he might have had after his first term long gone, and at least half of America not interested in anything he would do. I mentioned one of the reasons to elect Trump was to bring an end to the Biden and Democrat approach to doing things. Well, if any Republican was elected, presumably that's going to happen. And the second part of that was that he would be able to pick up on the positives that he had going for him at the end of his first term. But with a 4-year break, while I do believe that many of the things Biden has instituted and set the stage for would come to an end, but I don't see how anything that even his supporters would consider positive from the first term will be able to be picked up and carried through on in a positive fashion, particularly if he doesn't secure both houses of Congress. And that's another discussion. Well, anyway, those are some reasons why Trump should or should not be elected. I generally come down on the we need somebody else side of things. I think, again, for myself, I'm personally conservative. I think I'm publicly fairly liberal in a small L traditional sense of liberal when it comes to how we should govern at the federal level. But I don't think that Trump is a person who would be effective in accomplishing things that other potential Republican candidates could accomplish. And I think Trump's involvement in the primary sets the stage for a lot more negativity in the Republican debates and side of things, and a lot more destruction as opposed to construction when it comes to formulating a positive Republican platform and candidate in the course of going through a primary and wrestling with what is the Republican position on certain things. And I'm saying this as one who is moving away from traditional Republican polity on many issues, as I addressed in some of the other videos, particularly when it comes to foreign affairs and other policies. But I don't think Trump is the best choice. I don't even think Trump's presence as a choice in the Republican primaries is helpful for Republicans of framing a platform and a nominee to represent conservative interest on the national stage. I look forward to hearing what you have to say in support or rejection of anything that I've said. Thank you all very much for your time. Bye bye.